So Anadrol has an immediate impact on your strength. If you take Anadrol an hour before an event, you immediately get stronger, and that's because of adrenergic signaling. Usually it's Anadrol. People go into the competitions. Usually you'll see especially the super heavyweights. On the day of the competition, you'll see them blue. If they're white people, they'll look like blue because of the amount of Anadrol they took. I don't know what it does to blood circulation, but it ends up being where you look a little bit blue and like you've just died. But
wow, that's one of the most confusing compounds when you actually look at the pharmacodynamics of it and how it's working. It's like inherently like prevents estrogen clearance, and then it's also like progestogenic somehow, even though its chemical structure is a DHT derivative. It's like one of the most confusing anabolics I've ever seen to learn. And its affinity for the androgen receptor is undetectable. It's like, what the fuck is going on with that compound?
Why do you say the affinity for the androgen receptor is undetectable? I never heard of that before.
Oh, you've never seen like the binding assay studies where they check, relative to Primo, relative to Nandrolone, and it was like the lowest ones were like D-ball. I don't remember what they were, but at the very bottom of the totem pole, Anadrol was undetectable in its binding affinity for AR.
So, but the thing about binding affinities, right, is that they say nothing about the efficiency or efficacy of causing response elements from the binding. So, for example, you can have something that doesn't have a strong affinity for the androgen receptor, but when it does bind to it, causes an immediate response, right?
Right.
Or you could have something like that stuff you guys use on your hair, where that just holds onto the receptor but doesn't activate it that fully.
Right. So I would assume Anadrol has a lot of like satellite interactions with other receptors that you would not traditionally think of, because everyone just thinks how potent of an agonist of the AR is it. But I've never seen anyone give like an elaborate, good explanation of how it's doing what it's doing. I don't know. That'd be interesting for you to touch on.
My impression, I thought personally, was that it was affecting the androgen receptor as well as the progesterone receptor. I thought those two for sure it was affecting, and then probably the mineralocorticoid and glucocorticoids doing something there as well. I have some notes on it as well, but I never thought that it wasn't activating the androgen receptor. There's no way, because that...
No, it definitely does. It's just the affinity is so low that it was undetectable based on the binding assay. So like presumably it's still doing something, it's just not as potent as the others. But I guess that doesn't even factor in like dissociation rates or any of this kind of stuff that no one else, like everyone just looks at what is the binding affinity, and that's it. No one thinks about glucocorticoid interaction. No one thinks about, progestogenic, any of that kind of stuff. So, but it's very potent in what it does. So it's just kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, that's what I love about your channels. You're the first person that doesn't just talk about the androgenic signaling. Nobody else seems to have this idea that there's other kinds of signaling going on, and it doesn't really depend on the nature of the molecule. Like if it looks like a DHT molecule, doesn't mean like it acts like one. Small alterations in the molecule structure cause it to bind at different places and do all kinds of different things. But in terms of Anadrol, so Anadrol has an immediate impact on your strength. If you take Anadrol an hour before an event, you immediately get stronger, and that's because of adrenergic signaling.
So that's like sympathetic drive enhancement relative to something else. So it's like more potent at that than a traditional, more tissue selective anabolic. Like I don't know, like how does it facilitate that in a way that's any better than something else if it's not inherently Anadrol is like somewhat tolerable at like reasonable dosages among women, so it's not like super androgenic milligram for milligram. So like how does it facilitate that more than something else?
I do think it's more androgenic milligram per milligram, but I know what you're talking about. There are studies in which
because you'll have children and women that are well tolerating it at dosages actually comparable to what men are using for bodybuilding purposes. So you would think at a much lower dosage, and I've actually seen women deploy this in their performance enhancing protocols to avoid masculinization, is if they get a low enough dosed. If an underground lab is willing to dose it low enough and they don't have like a 50 milligram A-bomb, and you can actually cut it into small enough pieces, a girl can get away with like 5 milligrams potentially and get significant performance enhancement with a relative lack of masculinization that you'd get with some other compound.
How would that compare to Dianabol for a woman, like 5 milligrams? Would they get more?
Well, traditionally, apparently 10 milligrams is enough to give therapeutic androgen replacements in men. Like clinically, back in the 60s or 70s or whatever it was, you can replace your entire endogenous androgen production sufficiently with only 10 milligrams of Dianabol. So that in women is too much. So it's just, I don't know, it's kind of weird because some of the numbers are more favorable for Anadrol in a lot of cases. And it just seems like the dosages used might just be too high for what people are using.
Well, I definitely think doses that are too high, but also isn't it interesting to comment on the fact that both Trenbolone and Anadrol, which are the two compounds that cause the most acute strength gains, are both appear to be at least progestogenic.
Right. Yeah.
So they make,
yeah, definitely.
And I think also their effect, which people think has something to do with estrogen, and that water retention effect is probably also just the progesterone receptor signaling, which makes the body more sensitive to estrogen because it upregulates estrogen receptors.
There was some really obscure study somebody sent me recently. Apparently, Anadrol inherently, even though it's not a substrate for aromatase, it has a very high binding affinity for ER alpha. So that's how they think it might be exerting its effects. And then I forget how they said it was, but apparently it inhibits estrogen clearance, like its metabolism. So it can cause like not an upregulation, but more so like prevents you from getting rid of it properly. So you have more of an estrogenic burden just with your other whatever agents that you're using. So I don't know, maybe that's how it works too.
Yeah, that's very interesting. These things are not entirely straightforward. I mean, I've noticed this because like in the last year or so, I've been really interested in learning about neuroscience, and what I've realized is that so many molecules affect so many random receptors in the body that you wouldn't expect they affect. Like for example, melatonin agonizes the RXR and ROR receptors, which are agonized by that acne medication. I forgot what it's called. Accutane, exactly. It's a vitamin A. That's what the vitamin A receptor, RXR and ROR, is actually a target of melatonin, which we take before bed. So random molecules agonize random receptors. And we really, like, when we see the results of these steroids, I feel like we really don't realize what is, I mean, we blame it on androgen signaling, but it could be all kinds of things going on in the body that is causing these results.